Please join me in welcoming our host to the stage, Jacqueline Whittall.
Well, good afternoon, all. As you just heard, I'm Jacqueline Whittall. I'm a meteorologist and climate change journalist at the Weather Network in Canada. I'm also a climate change documentary maker, but what usually grabs people the most when I mention it is I'm a storm chaser. Yes, so I'm one of those crazy people that you see in the cars that are driving toward the tornado instead of taking cover from them. And you might ask, why do you do this, Jacqueline? Well, I do this because I learn so much about the storms when I'm in the field, and it really helps me to communicate the risks of extreme weather to many Canadians. Now, for the last 15 years, I have covered the most extreme weather around the whole world. I've been next to the world's largest ever recorded tornado. I've been in the center of 9 hurricanes, reported on countless blizzards, wildfires, and floods across the world. I truly have seen families lose everything that they have due to climate-fueled extreme weather. I've seen them face total devastation. And every time I've covered these events, I get on a comfortable plane and I fly home, and I leave these devastating scenes to return to my home with a sense of despair, feeling helpless and sorry for those affected. In 2020, I moved from Toronto to British Columbia, Canada, which I think is the most beautiful province in Canada. The next 4 years, I would experience a deadly heat dome taking the lives of 600 people in British Columbia. Heat records broken not one day, not 2, but 3 days in a row. And where that occurred was Lytton, BC. The 3rd day, the entire town burnt down to the ground. That was due to the extreme heat and dry conditions. In 2021, an atmospheric river event brought record flooding, compromising all of our major highway infrastructure in Canada, shutting off all shipping west to east for the entire country for weeks. And finally, that same year, my husband and I lay scared in our bed, waiting for a potential knock at the door that we too would be evacuated from our home due to a 90,000 hectare wildfire that was only a kilometer away from my home. For the first time, I couldn't get on a plane to go home because this was happening to me at my home. And it's time now, and it was time then, for me to make a commitment to redirect my career to climate change communication and storytelling. I'm truly honored to be here among all of you and everyone watching the live stream here at the Hub Live. Now, we have just one more flagship session to go today, and a couple things here. We'll be streaming our flagship session on the Climate Week New York City website at www.climateweeknyc.org. So if you want to make your voice heard, please tweet or share thoughts on X or Instagram using the hashtag ClimateWeekNYC. Now, a couple other things. We have a special video that has been produced especially for Climate Week New York City that will debut tonight at the reception, so make sure you stick around for that. I would now like to introduce our next panel to the stage, and it promises to challenge all of us. It promises to be thought-provoking and outline just how national and subnational governments are contributing to weaning the world off the thirst for fossil fuels. Please put your hands together and join me in welcoming a few of our guests. Zipporah Berman, the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London and co-chair of C40 Cities. And last but certainly not least, our moderator, Governor Bill Ritter, Jr., president and chair of the North American Board for Climate Group. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Before you depart, we appreciate your work and the introduction. So we're going to have a discussion. The two panelists and I are going to talk about something that I think is on the mind of a lot of people as we think about energy transition, and that's the refrain that we hear that you can't really in the use of fossil fuels anytime soon, maybe even ever. And especially you can't do it if you care about things like justice and equity and the economy. So there's a lot of people, I think, that may put up what I consider to be some false choices about our exit from fossil fuels over time because they make economic arguments that certainly appeal to a lot of people and appeal to their pocketbooks. And they make equity arguments that certainly also appeal to a lot of people, both those in the environmental justice movement, the justice movements generally, but also to people in public life. And so first question is going to go to a man who's absolutely in public life as the mayor of London. And I'll put it to you this way. Let's talk first about the role of cities, especially those in the C40 network, in influencing global policies that drive the transition away from fossil fuels. What is that role, and how can cities collaborate to create a united front on climate action?
Well, Bill, it's a pleasure to be here. Good to see so many people here this afternoon. Look, I'm a big fan of the current Secretary General of the United Nations. He said something really interesting recently, Antonio Guterres. He said, cities are the first responders to the climate emergency. And the reason why he said this, Bill, is the evidence over the last few years, the last few decades, is countries have been delaying taking action when it comes to the issues you've talked about, whereas cities have been taking action. We are the doers versus the delayers. In addition to being the mayor of London, apologies to my friends from New York, the greatest city in the world, I'm also co-chair of C40, which used to be 40 cities, now 96 cities across the globe. And we've got targets which we're on course to meeting to reduce our emissions by at least half by 2030. 3/4 of those cities who are members of C40, 3/4, 66, are doing much better than our respective governments. I'll give you some tangible examples of what we're doing. So I had a chat with the previous mayor of New York, and I said, listen, both of us invest huge amounts of money through our pensions indirectly in fossil fuels. Why do we divest from fossil fuels? And there's now 20 cities divesting our funds from fossil fuels. $500 billion is now no longer going to fossil fuels, is instead going to cleaner, sustainable energies. That's the power of cities.
So that's kind of the stick approach. I'm going to ask Zipporah a question about the carrots. As the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, you advocate for the rapid reduction of fossil fuel production. What incentives do you believe are most effective in encouraging fossil fuel economies to diversify their economies and invest in renewables, particularly given the uneven stages of development and economic reliance on fossil fuels?
That was a mouthful.
That was a mouthful.
It's great to be here. Look, I think one thing that we have to remember is at this moment in history, leadership matters. And these are tough issues. But that's why we've been working with thousands of organizations around the world, now in 117 countries that have endorsed the concept of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and 13 countries that have now formed a block of nations that are starting to grow the idea of this fossil fuel treaty. Countries like Colombia. Colombia is the 6th largest exporter of coal in the world. And I found President Petro really inspiring on the stage in Dubai when he joined the fossil fuel treaty, and he said, look, every day we're making the problem worse, and we know it. And we can't do this on our own. We need greater international cooperation. So that's one of the critical pieces. So we need leadership, we need international cooperation. The idea of a fossil fuel treaty is that it would be a companion to the Paris Agreement to help us meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Because for decades, we've been negotiating about emissions and targets, and meanwhile, we keep growing the production of fossil fuels. So right now, we're on track to produce 110% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than we can ever burn if we want to stay below 2 degrees. So, and we know the International Energy Agency, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're all really clear. If we want to meet our Paris goals, that means no new projects. It means no new investment. But that's not what we're seeing right now around the world. So how do we help countries cooperate, and how do those countries create new rules, new global governance in order to remove the barriers so that they're not continually expanding fossil fuels? So a couple of things. Right now, we know the Amazon is on fire, yet many countries are drilling for new oil in the heart of the Amazon just to service their debt. So what we need is, we have to stop tinkering around the edges right now. We have to look at serious restructuring, and I think that's tough to hear. So what does financial restructuring mean? What are the incentives? That means debt cancellation to keep carbon in the ground. It means to create more fiscal space. Last year, countries in the global south spent $843 billion just servicing their debt. And now they're struggling with climate damages, with the floods, with the fires, the extreme weather that we just heard is estimated to cost $16 million an hour, every hour in aggregate, over the past 20 years. So this is about supporting them to create together new economic structures. We can't rely on the ways of the past. And right now, a lot of the international bodies, look at the IMF, we're still relying on the ways of the past. This year, new agreements that the IMF asked countries to sign to get their loans, they had to commit to increase fossil fuel production. So we need to align that. We need wealth and fossil fuel damage levies to create alternative revenues. These companies are getting away with highway robbery. They're the most profitable companies on earth. And they have made $2.8 billion every year, every day, for the past 50 years, according to the IMF, according to the World Bank data. So we need to figure out how to move some of that wealth to get countries the support they need in order to do economic diversification. And it's not just about growing renewables. It's great what happened in Dubai last year, commitment to tripling renewables. But the atmosphere doesn't care how many solar panels we build. The atmosphere cares how many fossil fuel projects we don't build. So what that means is when we make commitments to increasing renewables, they have to be joined with displacing fossil fuel assets. That's the bottom line. We have to stop building fossil fuel projects, stop investing in fossil fuel projects. And CCS and BECCS and all of this modeling that we're seeing and that we've been talking about now for 30 years, let's face it, it's not working. Those solutions are not working fast enough. We may need some of them, but we can't use them as a justification to increase production. So if we're going to support countries in actually creating a plan to phase out fossil fuels, we need a companion agreement to the Paris Agreement, because right now, countries aren't talking about who gets to produce and how much. We're leaving it up to the markets. The markets aren't going to make sure that we stay within a global carbon budget, and they're certainly not going to ensure that we have justice and equity as we ensure a phase out of fossil fuels.
Somebody once said to me, markets do a lot, but they don't control timing. Markets do not control timing, and we're on a bit of a ticking clock here, that we have to worry about.
I'm not sure that's right.
What's that?
That's not right. I think they can control timing because they can control governments. You see, the incentive, to answer your question, to people in positions of power and influence is if you don't do it, you'll be voted out. The incentive is the first mover advantage. There are jobs to be created in building the solar panels, in building the wind turbines, in driving the electric buses, in installing the electric vehicle charging points, in the green economy. That's the incentive. Who sensibly would invest in those businesses, those sectors, park your moral case in fossil fuels? That is the business of the past. Anybody sensible, if a Martian landed, they would be foolish to invest in coal, gas, or oil. If they were smart, they'd invest in wind, in solar, and so forth, the energies of the next 300 years. So I think, markets can also be influenced in relation to people power, shareholders, and so forth. And look, in London, I stood on a platform in May where climate was on the ballot paper, it was a culture war. And we had the argument, and you know what? We won.
Yeah, so having been a governor, I said that we were going to invest in a clean energy economy, and in 2030 we'll have no more coal in a state that had over 65% coal in the portfolio when I became governor 2007. So that's 17 years. So I think we've had a similar experience, and a lot of that was driven not just by regulation, but also by economic circumstances and by a market. When we talk about fossil fuels, we group coal, oil, and gas together. Do you see some differences when you think about coal versus oil or gas in terms of their place in the future and our own reliance upon them as we go forward and try and transition to a clean economy? I'll throw it to you first.
Sure, of course there are differences in terms of how are we going to approach the replacement of those three fossil fuels. But I think what we've heard over the last couple of years from the oil and gas sector is a lot of obfuscation about those differences. You know, yes, coal, but gas is okay. Gas is, you know, a bridge. Gas might have been a bridge 10, 15, 20 years ago. Right now, gas is a blockade to a renewable future. It's displacing renewables. We now have evidence to show that the emissions, especially methane emissions, are underreported significantly. We can't keep building infrastructure, whether it's gas or oil or coal, at this moment in history, because every ton of carbon matters, and what we build today will be what we use tomorrow. You know, I'm just kind of horrified by what we're seeing right now in the markets. Saudi Aramco just did a loan, got their loans confirmed, and I was so horrified. It was a bond insurance, and it was $6 billion in bond insurance. $6 billion in bond insurance. It was referred to as a global medium-term note, maturing in 2064. If we're using that much oil in 2064, then that means we're on the trajectory we're currently on. And let's not forget that that trajectory means that huge areas of the planet will no longer be habitable for humans because we're going to see such lethal humidity. So we actually need to be planning for a survivable planet, and that actually means that we need to stop expansion now of all of those three fossil fuels. The solutions to how we replace them are going to be different. And often when I make this argument to the oil CEOs, I hear, but you know, that's ridiculous. We can't replace oil and gas right now with current technologies. Okay, maybe there's still a lot of work to do, for example, in aviation. That's 2% of global emissions. So if you look at what the IEA has put out this year, we could, with existing technologies today, by 2035, reduce oil and gas use in our economies by 50%. And that's not what we're doing. We're increasing it. So you know, we need renewable energy, we need electrification, we need to stop investing in fossil fuels, and we need to stop pretending that some of it is okay. Because right now, everybody, every country, every company wants to be the last barrel sold. So there's no limits. And there has to be limits on production and not just emissions.
I mean, my view, Bill, is I think we should be respectful to the global south, the global majority,
Absolutely.
who are suffering the worst consequences of a situation they didn't cause. And I think those of us in the global north should provide leadership. So what I'd say is, for those of us in the global north, the wealthier countries, those responsible for the catastrophe we face, we've got to make that transition as soon as possible. So, for example, I'm really pleased and proud that in July this year, the British public voted for a new government, and that new Labour government has announced no new oil or gas licenses on the North Sea. They've also set a quite strict target by 2030, double the amount of onshore energy produced, triple the amount of solar energy produced, quadruple the amount of offshore energy produced. I think for those in the global south, I think we've got to be a bit respectful lecturing them that you can't do oil, you can't do gas, you can't do coal straight away like us in the global north, because they're not responsible for where we are now, and they will need more time and more of a runway to make that transition.
So I'm going to be an apologist for the United States just for a minute, because I totally agree with you. I think that's exactly right. And I also think first world countries, developed countries need to lead by example. And we have the best climate administration we've ever had.
I agree.
With the Biden administration.
Agree.
But at the state level, California passed a rule saying no more vehicles sold that are internal combustion engines in 2035. Now over 10 states have followed that lead. Another number, I think it's up to 20 some, have low emitting vehicle standards. And so like addressing vehicles is going to be one of the most important ways for us to think about on the demand side, how to cut down oil and gas. And so at the state level, even with all that the federal government's doing, we're seeing a number of things happening at the state level and at the city level that are going to make real differences over time in what demand looks like in the automobile industry. I agree with you about aviation. Can you tell me, Zipporah, what is shipping? Is it like 3% of global emissions?
I think it's a little more.
It's something like that, over 3. So the two together, they call them harder to
The solutions are
decarbonize.
a bit easier in shipping, and we're already seeing some of them come into play.
Yeah. So is that a 15-year thing that can happen in shipping where we can decarbonize fleets?
Yeah, significantly. And also, let's remember, as we start reducing and phasing out fossil fuels, the problem actually becomes a lot easier because fossil fuels are so inefficient. 40% of shipping today globally is just to move fossil fuels around. So can we decrease emissions from fossil fuels quite significantly if we phase out fossil fuels? Absolutely. And then there's the technological fixes. But I want to address this question in the Global South because I'm working with a number of Global South governments right now who are working on the Fossil Fuel Treaty and others who are looking at joining the call for the Fossil Fuel Treaty. And I think we're designing this piece of work with equity and justice in mind. So what does that mean when it comes to production? And we hear the fossil fuel industry saying a lot, well, global energy poverty, there's 600 million people in Africa, we need to turn the lights on. Look, the fossil fuel industry has had decades, in fact, about 100 years to turn the lights on in Africa. And they've done a lot of fossil fuel development, and they haven't. Look at Nigeria. Huge oil development. 60% of the country still doesn't have energy because what we're seeing right now in the Global South by the fossil fuel industry is a colonial model. It's a continuation of the colonial model. We're treating Africa and increasingly Southeast Asia as the global North's gas station. And the impacts of that fossil fuel development are being seen in the Global South, and the benefits are leaving the Global South to the Global North. So if we want to support those countries in energy access, then we should be supporting those countries to help build a cleaner, safer world and not making the mistakes that we've made that have caused these problems. And again, the fossil fuel industry will say, but we need more development in the Global South. But where are they actually developing? 825 new oil and gas leases handed out in 2023. Where are they? 5 countries: Australia, Canada, the US, the UK, and Norway. The largest number of new permits in oil and gas in 1 year ever given out in the history since records began. 67% of all new oil and gas licenses since 2020 have been in those 5 global north countries. 51% of the expansion of fossil fuels planned today between now and 2050 in those 5 countries. So the fossil fuel is using this conversation about energy access in order to mask, I think, what they're actually doing. And what they're actually doing is the last gasp of the fossil fuel industry. They're trying to get in as much infrastructure and new projects as they can right now because they see the writing on the wall. And that's not going to support justice or equity in the Global South.
Okay, so I hear that. I do think that it's a transition and that it's important to understand in the transition how you assure that people are sort of brought along. So I'm just going to go back to the incentive part of the question. I'm not disagreeing with you. I just want to go back to the mayor for the incentive part of the question. And Zipporah, I want to talk to you about fossil fuel subsidies because we haven't really talked about that. I want to know what part of the treaty they are. But Mayor, what are the subsidies inside of a regulatory scheme or financial scheme that can really make a difference in ensuring that it's an equitable transition or that we make the transition at all?
Yes, a really important question, and that's at the crux of this discussion about the transition. How do we use the word carrot or stick? How do we incentivize this movement so the cities around the globe have a number of different ways of incentivizing that transition? We've got to take people with us. Sometimes it's fellowship, sometimes it's leadership. There's a great Henry Ford saying, people just want faster horses, right? But without being arrogant, you've got to realize you've got to provide leadership. That means educating citizens of your city or country about the consequences of inaction versus the costs of action. So, for example, an incentive is if you want permission to build any building in London, any building, it's got to be zero carbon during the construction from the whole cycle. If it's not zero carbon, you are not building in London. That's an incentive. So what that's led to is all our buildings since I've been mayor, when they're built, are zero carbon. I'll give you another incentive. If you're going to drive in London, an incentive, if you want to drive in London, is your vehicle must be a clean vehicle. If it's not, you've got to pay £12.50. That's meant in 8 years, we've managed to reduce the nitrogen dioxide in the central London, central London by 54%, in inner London by 21%, in outer London by 20%. When I first became mayor, they told me it would take 193 years to make the air in London lawful. We'll do it by next year. That's the incentive to make that transition. I'll give you another example of incentive. We have said to bus companies who want to operate in London, you can operate in London, but from now on, every bus that you use in London must be zero emission, electric or hydrogen. We have the largest number of electric buses in the Western world now. An incentive if you're going to be a taxi driver in London is it's got to be electric. More than half our black taxis are now electric. And we're giving incentives. We're giving funds, £500 million, to those businesses who want to set up businesses that are energy efficient in London. Our green economy in London is now worth 50 billion. By 2030, it'll be worth 100 billion. We are the green finance capital of the world. So there are incentives there in relation to, if you're going to be a bus driver in Bogota, you'll be driving an electric bus in Bogota. In Freetown, if you're going to start a business, you've got to invest in planting trees as well. So there are things you can do to incentivize action, a combination of carrot and stick. But the biggest incentive is for citizens is actually the future jobs are in the green economy. We'll help train you up. We're giving free training to people to be trained in the green economy. That's an incentive to scale up better paid high school jobs.
And I know it's the best city in the world, but it's just one city. I mean, imagine the collaboration among all the cities in the world that have the ability to do that, and at the subnational level, whether it's a state or a city, if we all sort of work together and have that kind of a viewpoint, then it is.
You'll know, but when you're a governor, I mean, governors and mayors can be far more nimble, dexterous. You can move fast, and we're close to our people, aren't we?
You care a great deal about jobs.
Spot on.
Care a great deal about work and not allowing people to make this argument that's really a false dichotomy against a future, that is fossil fuel free and a future that has economic viability. So we talked about subsidies. We haven't mentioned them so far, but they seem to play a role in maintaining fossil fuel economies. And it would seem to me if there's ever a treaty, it would have to deal with how particularly developed countries have offered subsidies to fossil fuels for a very long time.
Well, I don't think it's just developed countries. Even in the wealthy countries, there's been a commitment to reduce fossil fuel subsidies now for many years, and they're going up. The IMF reports last year that we're at $7 trillion a year. That's $13 million in fossil fuel subsidies a minute. And we need to focus on supporting people and not polluting companies and fossil fuels. So billions and billions of that money is going to the producers, to the big oil and gas companies here in the US and in Canada and other wealthy countries. Billions are going to those companies for carbon capture and storage, which we know is underperforming by about 80% and not working. And look, subsidizing planting trees, carbon capture and storage, while expanding drilling, it's like drinking carrot juice in the morning and then smoking a pack a day and saying, they cancel each other out. They don't cancel each other out. So we need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. If we do that, we can free up money for the reforms that support people. We need to boost social protection systems. We need to make direct cash transfers to vulnerable groups, or make grants or offer incentives to consumers, like for heat pumps, for electric vehicles, for renewable energy. The majority of fossil fuel subsidies are not helping us support people. They're helping us continue to support fossil fuel incumbents and getting us stuck in a system that's literally killing us.
So I'm sorry we're out of time, but we are out of time. And I thank you both for everything that you contributed to this discussion. Let's give them a round of applause, folks. Thank you. Thank you.
A big thank you to all our panelists for partaking in such a bold discussion on fossil fuel phase-out and energy diversification. We'll need radical action to go where we haven't gone before, so we're relying on policymakers to be visionaries. And Mary Khan, you've given us a lot to think about, as has my fellow Canadian, woohoo, and climate champion, Zibora Berman. Please join me in giving them all another big round of applause. All right, now up next, I'm pleased to introduce our next conversation, which is all about equitable access to climate capital. Please join me in welcoming Maktar Diop, the Managing Director at the International Finance Corporation, Nigar Arpadaurai, the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for COP29, and our moderator for the chat, Helen Clarkson, the CEO of Climate Group. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And it's great to be here with you on stage to discuss this important topic. Nigar, I'm going to come to you first. Gender equity is a key issue in both climate leadership and climate finance. What are your thoughts on the best route to turn the tide on gender inequality and promote outcomes for women in climate action?
Well, thank you so much. That's definitely one of the most important questions that we need to address altogether. Well, that's a fact that, that climate change impacts and exacerbates the gender issue. And according to the UN environmental program, so 80% of the displaced people are actually women displaced by the climate impact. So it's women and their children. So this is the fact, and we need to address that. And in reality, what we see is that women and children are vulnerable groups to the impact of climate change, and especially in the communities. And being the COP29 team, we see all those people that feels the impacts of climate change. And what is happening that women have no access to finance in many cases. So finance doesn't get to the women in reality. So they need decent works. They need data. So that's why there are many things that needs to be addressed from that perspective. And what we need to do, we need to support women. We need to support women entrepreneurs. We need to support the climate solutions driven and promoted by women. So there are many things that needs to be done, but access to finance, decent job, and data, access to data is something that I would point out.
Fantastic. Yeah. Maktar, let's talk about more about climate finance. The focus on equitable climate finance is really intensifying as we get to, this is our new acronym for the year, isn't it? The new collective quantified goal on climate finance, a big topic for COP29 as we negotiate that. What's the role of private capital in driving an inclusive transition?
No, thank you so much. I just came literally from a meeting where I was a captain industry. I just was sitting between Larry Fink and Paulson. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you have a sense of and it was a meeting called by Sultan Jaber, Dr. Sultan Jaber, who was coordinating all the UAE effort on financing. So as you know, during COP28, a lot of commitment have been made in terms of financing emerging economies and to make sure that the money that have been promised is going to the countries. Today, we need to close to $2 trillion a year to go to emerging markets to be able to have the right transition. We are far from that. And the question is how to get to these large numbers and to make sure that this money is going. So various ideas have been discussed. First, you need data. We need the market to know and estimate properly the risk, evaluate it. Often it's over evaluated. People think there is most risk in emerging economies than it exists. And then please note that there is still very little money going to emerging market, less than 1% for mitigation and around 15% for adaptation, which is still very low. And I think this is important because when you're talking about it, it's just the numbers that we throw there, but we talk about human life. When we talk about adaptation and how it affects women, adaptation will affect women because a big effect in emerging countries of climate change is scarcity of water. Or water collection in most of the developing countries is done by women. When we're talking about erosion, that the fauna, the marine fauna, is being destroyed, it means that we have less opportunity of fishing. Lots of the women on the coastal area are living for marketing the product of fishing. So all these elements are the realities that we are talking about when we talk about financing. And what we are trying to do at IFC and we've been doing is not only to do that, but to be able to catalyze the private sector by having them de-risk their investment in those countries, but also us in our investment to target it very much to climate change and women. Most of our thematic bond, which is 56 billion of commitment, IFC this year, most of our 17 or 18 billion are going to climate change, and most of the bonds that we are making on the market are either around gender or climate change, and more and more we have bonds which are having the two characteristics, climate change and gender.
Fantastic. Nigar, women-led startups often face significant barriers to securing early-stage funding, especially for climate-related businesses. Can you tell us your view about the effective ways to support women entrepreneurs and some of the flagship programs that you have on that?
Well, yes, that's exactly what we are trying to address now. As the Champions team, our main priority was always on engaging with all the non-state actors. So the role is the champion is here because it envisages engagement of non-party stakeholders. So because global climate action requires whole of society approach. It's not only up to the governments, it's also NGOs, civil society, private sector, cities, philanthropy organizations, academia. So from that perspective, our priority is on business engagement, and two of our flagship campaigns are the first on impact makers and second one, the climate proofing SMEs. So when we speak about impact makers, we are trying to find individuals who made impact with their solutions, with their ideas, with their projects, because there are many people, individuals that are passionate about climate. They are doing many things, but they remain unacknowledged. Especially, we see so many women startups, we see so many young people with great ideas that remain unacknowledged. So what we are trying to do, we are trying to showcase them, to find them, to showcase them, and to bring them even to COP. So that's one direction, and especially from that perspective, we are trying to find and support women also who have done already impact. And also, just this morning, we had a very good event where we had two startup solutions led by women, young ladies, and both of them said that credibility is an issue. So when they came with their projects to investors, they wouldn't believe them. So they wouldn't trust them. They would put some questions, how you will be able to do that because you are young, because you're women, and this kind of thing. So credibility is something that we've been discussing just this morning with our colleagues from IFC. And so yes, impact makers is that, and I would like to take this chance to thank IFC for being in the steering committee for impact makers. And the second one is SMEs. That's something that I'm really passionate about, because we speak about global climate action. We speak about private sector contributing to climate finance. Where are SMEs? With large companies, they understand the urgency. They put sustainability to the heart of their strategies in many cases, because they understand that it's a matter of reputation for them, and also it's the business opportunities. But SMEs are lacking that. So we keep speaking about SMEs because these are the backbone of economy. It's the real economy and 80% of the jobs on the market. And especially if we speak about inclusivity, so entrepreneurs, in many cases, owners of small businesses are women, young people. So this is also where we can support women entrepreneurs. So support of SMEs is something that we focus on.
Thank you. And Magdal, can you give us some examples of how the IFC is delivering inclusive climate capital in emerging markets, please?
We are about to finalize our new strategy on gender, led by my colleague Natalie, who is here. And we have some KPIs in it. Number of companies which are women-led. What you said on SME is spot on. How much access to capital, the financing they have. We are also want to ensure that we increase the number of projects which have a gender lens. Let me give you an example. I was just mentioning to my colleagues. Do you know that in some dry country in the Sahel, often the part of the cattle, the camels and the cows are taken care of by the men, and the small remnants by women. So people were building some water reservoir to give access to the cattle, and they were building them very high. They are totally forgetting that building at this height will just not allow women to be able to have more living. So these are concrete things that technical assistance, equity in those companies will allow us to bring as a knowledge to companies which are women-led to be able to design. We need to have women at the table, because what I was telling you, I will never have thought about it as a man, but a woman being there in the preparation of that project would have said, oh, if you want to target women, you need to do things differently.
Yeah.
So what we are doing more is equity. We are looking at ensuring that we have more women leaders. We work on initiatives like She Wins and She Wins Climate, which aims at supporting startups. And we know that, and when we take some equity and support these startups, this is a very strong signal to the market that we trust these young entrepreneurs, and the financier needs to bring the resource to support them. So that's what we are doing at the micro level. And at the macro level, we ensure that the policy of the government, when it comes to private sector, are giving some clear indication and put some rule of regulation which are ensuring gender equality and gender parity in financing and so forth. Let's not forget data. Because often when we talk to policymakers and financiers about it, they tell us, give us the evidence that it's a problem and what is the magnitude of the problem. So doing that is by itself a very important contribution.
Fantastic. We're out of time. Niga, I'm going to give you one quick word on concrete outcomes you're hoping to see on this topic in particular at COP29.
Well, COP29, we are committed to principles of inclusivity and openness, and so that's why we want to have the voices of the vulnerable groups heard. We have already launched our initiatives, 14 initiatives, and in each of initiatives we try to consider the considerations and feedbacks of the vulnerable groups, and women also specifically. So basically we are committed, and we think that it's a finance COP, so we want to see parties coming to consensus, but we also want to see private sector being at the forefront. And also we think that if we speak about the just transition and the finance, we need to speak about gender just transition. So we want to have gender factor at the heart of our actions.
Great, thank you. Please join me in thanking them both for this conversation, all their hard work on this important topic. Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to stay here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm pleased to be moderating our next conversation, and we're going to be sticking with the topic of climate finance. We know that green will cost and that a successful journey to a net zero transition could require up to $200 trillion of total investment by 2050, or $7 trillion annually. So what is the route to a successful net zero strategy which makes project bankable? That's a phrase we hear a lot. And where are financiers placing their focus? So to unpack this, please join me in welcoming Ambrosi Faioli, Vice President of the European Investment Bank, and Tuva Larsson, General Partner at Noriam VC.
Hi.
Thank you. Ambrosi, I got that wrong. Sorry. Hello. Great, thank you. So I'm going to start an opening question to both of you. How close do you think, we've been hearing about tipping points today, how close do you think we are to a tipping point where financiers will begin to view green projects as equally profitable as investments in fossil fuel-laden portfolios? Who would like to start on that? Tuva, do you want to?
I'm happy to start. We've been around now for 7 years, and so much has happened during those 7 years. We've seen the number of impacting climate funds increase immensely. We've seen journalist funds really kind of increasing their interest in this space. And we think that's absolutely right. Like, this is where we see the biggest investment opportunities of our time. But if we look at this on a global perspective, still only 1% of assets under management are invested into impact and climate. So we have a long, long way to go. A lot has happened during the last 7 years, but we expect a lot more to happen over the next 5. Because we need to.
Great. And what's your view from the European Investment Bank?
I think we are getting very close to the tipping point.
Right.
And because there are two movements in opposite directions. The first one is more and more oil assets are becoming stranded assets. And the closer you get into the green transition, the more you will have stranded assets if you have oil assets. And at the same time, you see also, thanks to big progress in technology, investments in green that are becoming much more profitable than before. And so I think we are really close to this point. And you see that in the figures that are, for example, the climate finance report that is published every year by the multilateral development banks, EIB is one of them, show that there is a record number of, in terms of volume, of projects in climate finance in 23, 125 billion euros, and also a record number of private sector mobilization that goes with these projects, that has doubled compared with last year. So it's something that really there is some movement, and I think one of the reasons is we are getting closer to the tipping point.
Great. And the European Investment Bank has been a key player in climate finance for a number of decades, earned its reputation as one of the world's main financiers of climate action and environmental sustainability. Given that estimate I talked about, how much it's going to cost us to net zero, how are you planning to mobilize capital at that scale?
Well, actually, what we are doing at the European Investment Bank, which is the bank of the European Union, is a big exercise of transforming ourselves in becoming the climate bank of the European Union. And for that, we have put in place a strategy with a minimum of 50% of what we do has to be in climate or environment, and environment is as important as climate to me. By mobilizing private financing to reach 1 trillion of investment by 2030, and to have all our projects being Paris aligned. That is well underway, and actually we are well on track. Last year, we have done 60% of our projects in climate and environment sectors. So that's something that explains that why we are doing so well in terms of climate funding. Now, that being said, the needs are huge, and we need to do more also because what we see with the reports that have been published by, for example, Mario Draghi, is that more and more green has to go along with competitiveness. And that's why we have to strengthen the projects and the support we give to the green projects, especially through capital allocated to these projects. And the last thing I would say is, the more we look at the evolution, the more we think also, if we want to be independent, strategic autonomy of Europe is very important. And for that, we also need to invest a lot, and that's what we try to do, for example, by accelerating investments in renewable energy.
Great, and Tuva, the same on capital mobilization from the VC point of view. Bloomberg NEF came up with that net zero by 2050 up to $200 trillion figure. Where do you see the most promising areas for VC investment in the next decade? Should you be prioritizing specific sectors, specific technologies? How are you going to drive impact?
Yeah. If we start by just looking at kind of where are the biggest emissions, because that's a great start if you're an impact investor, of course, then we will really prioritize the energy transition to really make sure that we have clean and affordable energy. If we have that foundation, a lot of kind of positive effects will follow. The other sector that I would mention is transportation and electrification, which is well underway, but we still need to kind of make progress to reach those targets. And the third sector that I would mention is to decarbonize industries, such as the chemical industry, steel, etc. Those are industries that we also really need to figure out how to do in a sustainable way for this to work out.
Great. And let's talk about legislation. We've had the success here of the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, provided billions in tax credits, clean energy projects. Does Europe need something similar to accelerate the green investment? And if so, where should it focus?
Well, actually,
you look excited to jump in on that.
Actually, well, first, let's welcome a very positive movement that the US is back to the table of the Paris Agreement. Yeah. And that's something that is really the most important thing. Yeah. Now, actually, when you look at IRA versus what we do in Europe, what is clear is that the IRA is very, very clear in the way it has been formulated. Also, 70% is in tax credit, so it's rather simple, which is good. And we in Europe, we have done things with a wider set of instruments. With, for example, it includes an increasing pricing of carbon over time, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and a lot of instruments that have been probably less readable. But when you compare over time, actually the amount of support to the green transition in Europe and in the US is very much alike. And the targets in Europe actually are a bit more ambitious than the targets in the US. So I would say that this is probably something where we are following something that is happening in the US also, which is we need to do more, to industrialize more, and to accelerate the investments in the green transition.
Yeah, no, I think IRA is a great initiative, and it has had some effects also if we look at our portfolio, that portfolio companies have actually kind of relocated some of their production to the US based on the incentives that they can get here. We also acknowledge the European Green Deal, that I think is a great start. I think the challenge for our portfolio companies, and we invest in super early stage companies with quite limited resources, is that it is, like you say, it's a lot of kind of different initiatives and can be a little bit hard to navigate for these smaller startups. So in that way, I would kind of really encourage the simplicity and kind of access to capital in a smooth way for these early stage companies, although I again appreciate the different initiatives here.
If I may just add, simplification is one of the objectives of the new commission of Ursula von der Leyen.
Great. Let's talk about sectors and the tech we should focus on. I'm going to talk, this is my favorite or least favorite phrase is bankable projects, because I hear it all the time. We hear from, we work with governments and particularly state and regional governments, and they always say, we've got all these things we can't get finance for. And then on the other side, we hear banks saying, well, we need to find bankable projects. Can you unpack the phrase bankable project for us? We hear it a lot. What characteristics make a project bankable from the EIB's perspective, particularly in emerging markets or new technologies?
It actually depends. It depends when you talk about, for example, projects that we do in Europe, projects that we do in developing countries. In developing countries, and it's also valid in emerging countries, where we can help is bringing technical assistance, capacity building, because very often project preparation, an instrument to support project preparation, is something that is essential to bring projects to life. We have for that a very good instrument that we have built with the European Commission or the German cooperation, for example. One example that I find interesting, Kiribati. This is a small island in the Pacific, and they have a big issue, which is the island where 70% of the population lives is going to be underwater in a few decades. So they are thinking in terms of trying to relocate it in another part of the territory. And the question is, could we put a port there? Because there is a port in the big island. And that's where we help them in technical assistance. We'll see if it leads to a project or not. Now, for bigger projects like where there is a big interest in terms, for example, of batteries or hydrogen or this kind of thing in Europe, then we can do blending, which is mixing our funding resources with grants from the European Commission.
Right. So what are you looking for in a project? Or is to do with the risk profile? Or how do you think about that?
Well, actually, when you look at a project, that's what makes us different from a commercial bank. We are a public institution, so we are looking at projects with a view of having, of course, we are a bank, so we expect our money to be to back. But we look at the projects also from an environmental and social point of view. And for us, for example, the just transition, that we accompany those regions who have to decarbonize a lot. We are doing that to help them with upskilling, reskilling of the workers that are going to suffer from the closure of coal mines, for example. So that's the way we try to work.
Great. And Thibault, what sectors or industries do you think should get the bulk of green finance over the next decade to get the decarbonisation?
No, I think it's again these three kind of biggest emission sectors, but just to highlight a few initiatives in those spaces. If we look at energy, in the energy sector, energy storage is really at the tipping point. We'll need a lot more of that to be able to really kind of accelerate the deployment of green renewable energy sources that are by nature intermittent. And this is a sector that we have already invested into, a company called TerraLayer that is kind of building basically an AWS or a cloud service, but for energy storage. Right. That's a great example, I think. Another sector is this industry decarbonization, where we're excited about kind of recycling of, for example, polyester, big emission driver. Where we have invested into a company called Syre that has taken on a really kind of bold mission to enable that transition. So those are some of the sectors that I'm really passionate about.
Great. And we heard this morning, we were talking about positive tipping points, and the example came out about EVs and how people really need to understand how the EVs, you move them out of cars at about 80%, but they can be sources in buildings down to about 20% of life, so creating these virtuous circles.
Yeah.
So I've got one last question for each of you. The European Investment Bank recently declared that it will stop funding fossil fuel projects and focus solely on green investments. How important do you think that divestment from fossil fuels is relative to the direct investment in green technologies for us to get to net zero?
Okay, so our strategy is very clear. We have stopped financing any projects in fossil fuel since 2019. Yeah. We have not divested the projects that we had. Right. We so keep them on the portfolio. But actually today they represent 0.4% of our assets. So the push now is for accelerating the investments in renewable energy, in energy efficiency, in innovation related to climate, because we know that some of the innovations are not there yet, and we need them to reach the climate neutrality, which is the objective in Europe by 2050, and to do everything we can so that we can speed up that for the competitiveness of Europe and for the strategic autonomy of Europe.
Great. And just as a sector example, EV manufacturers like Tesla and BYD are scaling rapidly, but the supply chain for raw materials is under scrutiny for environmental and social concerns. How can VCs help mitigate those issues and support growing EVs against that background?
Yeah. A great question. And when we make investments, we always look at the net impact of each investment that we do. So we look at the upside, for example, replacing a diesel car by an electric vehicle and every kilometer driven and calculate the CO2 emissions avoided by that. But then we also need to take into account that kind of sunk cost of the production of each vehicle. And the kind of calculation needs to make sense so that it's net positive. And in addition to that, we work very closely with our portfolio companies in terms of really identifying what are the main risks for each company. And then we help the companies adopt policies and processes to really be able to tackle those risks and challenges. And I think it's clear that we need to go into this eyes wide open. There will be challenges. There is not always a kind of black and white with these investments, but we need to be there for these founders and help them really help them build sustainable companies.
Great. This is a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. And it's giving me a bit of optimism we might get the hundreds of trillions that we need to get moving. Thank you both. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.
What a great few conversations we've just had the pleasure of listening to. Climate finance is the theme for this part of the Hub Live, and it's the theme for COP. We're going nowhere fast without significant investment, whether it's from businesses prioritizing sustainable operations and investing in the future of green technology, or governments unlocking trillions needed to fund a just transition and adaptation efforts in lands beyond their own borders. Which leads me to introduce our final conversation for the day on the topic of climate justice through the lens of climate finance. Please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Ryan Pinder, Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs for the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and Angela Barenko, the Executive Director for North America at Climate Group, to this stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline. It is such a pleasure to be sitting opposite you, Attorney Pinder. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
I really am excited for this very important conversation on financial justice. So let me start just by setting the scene a bit. It's 2024, and the nations which contribute the least to global carbon emissions are still bearing the brunt of the impact of climate change, whether it be sea level rise, frequent storms, or even more and more every day we have incidents of extreme heat. In the case of the Bahamas, the nation you represent with a population at the front line of the climate emergency, access to equitable finance is everything. It's literally a lifeline. So let me jump into the first question.
Sure.
How do you envision climate finance evolving to meet the needs of vulnerable nations? And what changes are required to ensure it becomes more accessible and equitable without burdening recipient countries with excessive conditionalities?
Well, the excessive conditionalities is an important component. When you think about climate finance, and especially concessionary climate finance, the hoops that a small country like the Bahamas has to jump through to even be able to try to access those are significant. But some of the changes that we think need to happen is, the Bahamas is regarded as having a high GDP per capita income. That means that we get graduated out of many of the concessionary frameworks. Now, you would think that, okay, so you're a rich nation. Well, that's not the case. We have executives and a significant amount of expatriate population who are wealthy. But the real indigenous Bahamians, the Bahamian citizens themselves, if you would have them isolated as an income group, we would qualify for concessionary financing. So automatically, we don't qualify for a lot. What we want to see is we want to see a vulnerability index be used when you talk about concessionary financing. Who are the most vulnerable countries? What does vulnerability mean? And those should be the ones who get first priority to concessionary financing. It's very frustrating that we have a climate crisis that affects the Bahamas and other small island developing states. We have hurricanes that come through and do massive damage year after year, island after island. And then we have to go out and borrow at high interest rates just to rebuild. And it's a perpetual cycle. And we're borrowing from the same countries who have caused the climate crisis that we're borrowing for to rebuild. So it's a crazy cycle. It's circular. And it really puts countries like the Bahamas in a situation where it's a perpetual end. And at some point in time that your debt burden becomes so large, you can't now develop your country and you can't now develop your people. And then it all blows up, and guess who steps in? The IMF. Fun.
I mean, I'm going to come back to this point that you made, which I think is really critical to the conversation, which is holding major polluting countries accountable for their contributions to climate change. But specifically, what do you think is the role of international legal frameworks in ensuring that nations meet their financial commitments to vulnerable countries, And what are you, as the Bahamas advocating for stronger enforcement or frameworks?
Sure. I mean, diplomacy is good, right? We all want to be diplomats, and we all want to be nice to people, and that's fine, and that's all good. But that really doesn't get you anywhere. I think we've seen that with the results out of COP year after year. I think when you look at the loss and damage fund out of COP that is unfunded and really not properly set up and certainly not serving the mandate, diplomacy has an end, and it has an end point, and we get tired of talking. We believe that you have to be forceful as a jurisdiction, especially a jurisdiction who is most vulnerable. We are very active at the International Court of Justice on the request for an advisory opinion. That advisory opinion will be whether states themselves can be held liable for neglecting climate regulation, neglecting greenhouse gas regulation, and effectively perpetuating the climate crisis. We think that that's going to be a landmark case at the International Court of Justice. I'm prepared to go up in December and argue in front of The Hague on this issue. It is an issue that's perpetuated by small island developing states. And we believe that if we can win that case and get an advisory opinion that says that states themselves have liability for failure to act in the climate crisis, that gives us a legal position and a position where we can impose liability on those who are polluting the most. And then that translates, I think, into climate finance. It translates into not only concessionary loans, maybe it translates into sovereign loan forgiveness, taking some of that debt burden off of small countries like the Bahamas so we can actually develop for our people. And so we think that climate litigation is a legitimate grounds for us to pursue. And the end point is, I think, climate finance reform at the end of the day. And we think, small country carrying a big stick is an important position to be in the world. And yes, we're playing in every forum, right? We're diplomats. We litigate. We go to the United Nations and try to get environmental concerns put in any negotiations we're doing. I'll give you an example. Recently, I was up here in New York at the United Nations negotiating the Global Tax Convention that the United Nations is sponsoring. And I fought tooth and nail to get environmental concerns placed within those terms of reference, because what's important is that you link environmental issues to taxation as well. And you do it in a multilateral global setting where every country is treated equally. And so we believe that participating in each element is going to help us put together a big picture and a comprehensive package of climate finance, both globally and domestically. We think that's very important.
And I love this, I think, comprehensive view of accountability, which I think gives us a lot of tangible things that we can advocate for. Flipping the question a bit, thinking about the fair distribution of those proceeds then, how do we ensure that nations suffering will receive the support that is proportional to their, the impact? How can we reimagine the architecture to prioritize those most affected and ensure that funds are distributed in the most just manner?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because certainly raising the funds and getting access to the funds is one thing, but who's going to spend the funds and who's going to do it equitably is another thing. I'll give you an example that I thought rather funny, and it's sensitive, but I thought it was rather funny, is that some of the developed countries, primarily the United States, are looking to attribute their funding to Ukraine as climate finance. And countries that are vulnerable to true climate crisis, and I don't want to be unsensitive, but not acts of war, but true climate crisis, are then not going to be able to have that access to those funding. Certainly, I think the vulnerability index I spoke to is a good objective means to understanding what you should be spending money on and who you should be spending it through. I think what you need to also look at is the mitigation and adaptation components of a country, and what do you have to do to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis, and different countries will have different adaptation strategies. For instance, the Bahamas, we're a low-lying island country. Major hurricanes come through and flood our islands. We certainly have a problem with displacement of persons after hurricanes. And so we think, one, the adaptation of our coastlines is an important spend to help provide a barrier to hurricanes. But we also think that providing assistance to displaced persons, because we can only do so much, is a function of adaptation as well. And so I think you have to understand the priorities of the countries and measure that against the level of vulnerability that they face to really have an objective criteria on how you spend your climate finance dollars.
I think, moving sort of down the column of funding, I think is kind of interesting. Completely hear you on that. So I think the compounding issue is that once, let's say, the money gets there, so many nations and so many communities across the world, globally, are struggling to actually access those funds due to complex application processes, stringent, conditions. And so it's interesting. So, we've followed the money all the way from actually holding people accountable to then having it prioritized. But then there's another barrier, which comes from all of the process, right? So what reforms do you think are needed to streamline access to the funds? How can international institutions and donors better align priorities with those immediate needs of countries like the Bahamas?
So I think that issue is really twofold. One, it's certainly a complexity issue on how do you access these funds. And it's not only sovereigns looking to access climate finance funds. I mean, that's a problem we have worldwide in a number of different areas. Those that are involved in NGOs would know this. When you apply for grant funding, for example, the complexities that an NGO has to undertake just to be able to submit a comprehensive grant funding application is enormous. Well, imagine now a small country. We have 400,000 people in our country, and we have limited capacity. Certainly I could probably count the climate experts on maybe my fingers and toes that are in the Bahamas. And so we have a capacity issue as well. So you have the complexity issue that we look to simplify. That's a tough one because that seems to be getting worse by the day. And then we have a capacity issue inside the Bahamas and inside small countries like the Bahamas in order to have the expertise and talent to do what is necessary in this complex world. So first and foremost, I think part of it is capacity building on our side, and we're certainly willing to participate in that capacity building, but we would want to see equal treatment on the funding side. And then the question is, okay, is it loans, and are you just facilitating a debt load of a small sovereign country? Or are we really looking at grants and money that is available to be given or taxed? I spoke about the tax convention of the United Nations and how we're trying to link environmental concerns with global tax policy. CARICOM, which is the global group of Caribbean nations, has taken a position. We believe that there should be a 2% tax on the net income of fossil fuel petroleum manufacturers and straight down the value chain. And we think that 2% tax should be a global tax that goes into a fund to help fund vulnerabilities as a result of the climate crisis. And we're glad we were able to get environment tagged to tax in the tax convention terms of reference, and these are the types of things that we're going to be advocating. Because really, it shouldn't only be the countries, we talked about the ICJ matter, that are liable. We think private companies who have ignored, in the face of hard evidence over the decades and generations of what they are doing to the world, should now pay, and should now pay those who are most vulnerable. And so, if we can set up a mechanism whereby it's not concessionary loans, and it's really a pool of funds that are available to those who are vulnerable, I think that creates some simplification. Then you just have to qualify and show that what you're using the money is really for proper adaptation and mitigation efforts.
I love that. And you touched upon this earlier, but I think it's worth coming back to, which is obviously the role of adaptation being so critical and the climate finance being directed towards adaptation and resilience building in those frontline nations. But can you talk a little bit just quickly on the legal frameworks that you talked about, and how they can really play and what you're advocating for in that realm to create that long-term support and accountability?
Well, like I said, certainly we have the International Court of Justice advisory opinion that's forthcoming. We think that's very important. We know there's a number of causes of action that are against private entities that are existing through the world, some that are being treated fairly by the courts, and some we don't think are being treated fairly at all. We think that certainly forcing legislative reform in different countries is important and vital to bringing a kind of legal regulatory environment. For too long, the developed countries and the countries of the global north, frankly, have ignored climate regulation to the peril of countries in the global south and vulnerable countries like small island developing states. We need to impose proper regulatory framework with the teeth that's required to enforce it. And so, from a legal point of view, you certainly look at the litigation side, but you have to look at the regulatory and legislative side as well. We think those are equally important in trying to reach the end game where industry is regulated appropriately, and when industry does harm the environment, they have to pay. And they have to pay to help those who are harmed. And those are important, I think, legal frameworks that we think are just and equitable.
Thank you. Final question, and this is a moderator's privilege here. I'm going to throw something new at you.
Sure.
It's clear that you are very passionate about this work and very much the expert both on the legal frameworks and the climate finance. And in talking before, you told me a little bit about your personal story about some of your family, and I would love for you to share. What is it that fuels your interest in this work every day?
No, I mean, I appreciate that question because it is personal. We are a country in the Bahamas where 75% of our GDP is linked to tourism. We're also a country that has indigenous fishing and farmers in our country. And 40% of our economy is tied to the blue economy, meaning the economy that originates out of the ocean. And what we're experiencing, ocean temperature rise that are killing off corals that are directly affected with our tourism industry. We're having ocean level rises. We're seeing as a result of that our fish stock is being altered. The fish stock that my family, all of my family on my father's side are fishermen. The fish stock that they have fished generation after generation after generation is being depleted, is going into deeper waters to try to get cooler waters out of the reach of the fishermen. And it's really having an adverse impact on a generation-old industry of an island country. And now what do we do to combat that? Because we have a whole group of Bahamians who now don't have a trade. And so are we just to say, go retrain yourself? So we have to build different capacities. If that's the end result, that finite industries that have supported generations after generations of Bahamians is now gone as a result of the climate crisis, well, what are they going to do? Are we going to have to retrain them? Are we going to have to teach them how to get different fish stock? Are we going to have to find out what apparatus they need to go deeper to get the fish that they get? And it's a tragedy. It's a legitimate tragedy that's happening that frankly, the large developed countries just overlook and don't really care about. But it's something where, in our small country, it touches almost every person in some form or fashion. And that's an adaptation element. You think about adaptation, you're building seawalls, and you're planting mangroves, and you're doing all of that, and that's all good adaptation. But you have adaptation to the people. And what are they going to do? How are you going to retrain them? Generations after generations who have only known fishing, and now the fish are no more. And that's a real issue of adaptation that I don't think gets enough focus when we go and we talk at the climate events, and you always hear the terms mitigation and adaptation. Everybody speaks about mitigation and adaptation, but what does it really mean? And you talked about in an earlier question, what are the objectives and criteria to access funding? Well, frankly, that is as objective a criteria as I know, touching the people themselves and changing their livelihoods. And that's the type of, I think, discussions and analysis and frameworks that we have to be talking about when we talk about the climate crisis, who's causing the harm, who's bearing the harm, and what type of adaptation is required. So just so a country like the Bahamas, a country that's smaller than some city blocks, it seems, with 400,000 people, we got to protect our livelihood.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Attorney Pinder. A round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, we'll turn it back to Jacqueline.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Well, that was a brilliant discussion, and the first time we've heard about the importance of strengthening international legal frameworks to hold polluters accountable and ensure climate finance commitments are met. I have no doubt we'll be hearing more about the power of climate laws in enacting climate justice in the near future. Now that brings me to the end of our agenda for the Hub Live. I'd like to thank all the speakers and partners we heard from today, and I'd like to thank Hitachi Limited, our Hub Live partner for Climate Week in New York City this year. As mentioned earlier, Hitachi are actually hosting a network reception right here at the Glass House, which will begin shortly. And they'll be debuting a very special video that they put together especially for Climate Week here in New York City. So please do stay and watch that. Now we have another packed agenda for you tomorrow right here in the Hub Live, where we'll focus on climate technology and innovation in our third and final flagship session in the morning. That's before delivering a series of thematic sessions on everything from national climate action plans and climate and its impact on health to 24/7 carbon-free electricity and low-emission steel supply chains. We also have a number of sessions dedicated to exploring the Inflation Reduction Act and its impact on Latino communities, so there's truly something for everyone. So we'll see you right here tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.